is Isabella Hayes, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the invisible one in my own family. At birthdays, I was the child sitting in the corner, clapping for everyone else while no one clapped for me. At dinners, my words were drowned out before they even reached the table. And at reunions, I was the ghost they chose not to see. They called me useless, an afterthought, a mistake. I carried those words like chains, until one night I walked into a room where they pretended I didn't exist. What they didn't know was that I hadn't come alone, and the silence I had kept for years was about to be broken in a way none of them could ever forget. From the very beginning of my life, I understood what it meant to be present in a room, but absent in the hearts of those who should have loved me most. My earliest memories are not filled with laughter or lullabies, but with shadows and silence, the kind that wraps around a child until she questions whether she even belongs in the world at all. My name is Isabella Hayes, and in my parents' home, I was little more than background noise, unseen, unheard, unacknowledged. I remember sitting cross-legged on the carpet at birthday parties, watching candles flicker on cakes baked for my siblings, listening to the cheers, the clapping, the singing. When it was my turn, when the calendar shifted to my day, the house remained quiet, the kitchen table bare. There might have been a cupcake or two bought last minute from a grocery store, but never a gathering, never laughter, never a moment where I felt like I was worth celebrating. It was as if my birth had been a mistake they were too polite to admit in public, so instead they erased me in private. At the dinner table, I often tried to speak. I would share something small from school, a test I had passed, a story I had written, even just an observation about the weather. But every time my voice was drowned out by louder ones, cut short by a change of subject, dismissed by a hand wave from my mother or the sharp clearing of my father's throat. The message was always the same: you are not worth listening to. Silence became my cage, and I learned quickly that speaking only reminded them I was there, and they didn't want to be reminded. So I began to fold inward. I became the girl who stared at her plate, who chewed slowly, who let her siblings fill the air with stories while I became the shadow at the edge of the table. My parents never scolded me harshly, never raised their hands against me. No, their cruelty was colder than that. It was the cruelty of absence, the cruelty of pretending that their own child was invisible. School was no refuge either, because children notice what adults teach them, and my siblings learned quickly that mocking me carried no consequence. They repeated my parents' words, calling me useless, reminding me that I would never measure up. If I fought back, my parents said I was causing trouble. If I stayed silent, they said I was weak. There was no way to win, so I stopped playing the game. I watched my siblings praised for achievements, wrapped in pride that was never offered to me, and I wondered if I had been born into the wrong family, if perhaps some cosmic era had placed me in the wrong house. But inside me, even then, a spark refused to die. I remember one night in particular, when I was about 10 years old. I had drawn a picture for my mother, staying up past midnight to perfect the shading, to make it something beautiful, something she might finally notice. I handed it to her the next morning, my heart pounding, my small hands trembling with anticipation. She looked at it for less than 2 seconds before setting it aside, muttering that she didn't have time for this. The rejection sliced deep, and I ran to my room, tears burning down my cheeks. I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling, whispering to myself, I will not always be invisible. One day they will see me. That night, I didn't know how, I didn't know when, but that vow settled in my bones. It was the first time I realized that my life could be more than the shadow they had cast upon me. Years passed, and the neglect became routine. I stopped waiting for hugs at the door. I stopped hoping for someone to ask about my day. I stopped expecting to be noticed. but that vow I had made in my childhood stayed alive, burning quietly, hidden behind lowered eyes and polite silence. My parents thought they had broken me, but what they didn't understand was that every dismissal, every ignored word, every forgotten birthday was shaping something powerful inside me. They were teaching me resilience. They were sharpening my hunger. They were unknowingly feeding the fire that one day would blaze out of control. The breaking point came when I was 16. That year, I won an award at school, first place in a national writing contest. It was the first time a teacher had ever pulled me aside and said, "Isabella, you have a gift." For weeks, I carried that certificate in my bag, waiting for the right moment to show my family, hoping that maybe, just maybe, this would be the thing that made them look at me differently. At the next dinner table, surrounded by cousins and relatives, I laid the award on the table, my cheeks flushed with pride, my small voice small but steady as I explained what it meant. For a moment, I believed they might finally smile, finally clap, finally acknowledge me. Instead, my father glanced at it once before pushing it aside to make room for dessert. My mother shook her head and muttered, "Don't embarrass yourself." The table moved on as though nothing had happened, laughter resuming, voices rising, and I sat frozen, my hands clenched under the tablecloth so tightly that my nails dug into my skin. In that moment, something inside me shattered. The ember that had burned for years burst into a flame of clarity. I knew then that no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, this house would never see me. I could either let their silence bury me alive, or I could take that flame and build something of my own. That night, I made my choice. From that day forward, I stopped asking for their attention. I stopped showing them my drawings. I stopped telling them about my grades. I stopped waiting for their smiles. Instead, I began quietly preparing to leave. I worked small jobs after school, saved every coin I could, and started planning for a future that did not include their approval. I studied late into the night, not for their praise, but for my escape. I wrote in secret journals, filling pages with plans, with dreams, with promises to myself that one day I would not only survive, but I would make them regret ever pretending I didn't exist. When I finally turned 18, the walls of that house no longer felt like home. They felt like a prison. Every hallway whispered with memories of being ignored. Every corner carried the echo of words like useless. And I realized if I didn't leave now, I might never escape. I packed my life into one small suitcase, nothing more than a few clothes, some books, and the journals where I had written my secret dreams. I didn't say goodbye because goodbyes are for people who care, and I knew my parents wouldn't notice if I was gone until the table felt lighter at dinner. I remember walking down the street in the pale glow of a street lamp, the night air biting my skin, my heart pounding with both fear and freedom. For the first time, I wasn't the forgotten girl in someone else's house. I was my own person, even if I had nowhere to sleep that night. I found shelter in a cramped apartment above a noisy bar, its single window rattling whenever the buses roared past. The wallpaper peeled, the ceiling leaked, and the air smelled of smoke and spilled beer, but it was mine. For the first time in my life, I could breathe without waiting for someone else's permission. Survival became my teacher. I worked late shifts at diners, scrubbing tables until my fingers ached, then rushed to morning classes with my eyelids heavy, but my spirit awake. I learned how to live on instant noodles, how to make a pair of shoes last through 2 winters, how to stretch a single paycheck into rent, books, and the cheapest groceries I could find. There were nights I cried into my pillow, wondering if my parents were right, if I really was useless. But then I would open one of my journals, read the promises I had written to myself, and remember the vow I made as a little girl. One day they will see me. That vow pulled me through every sleepless night, every cruel remark from strangers, every pang of hunger. College was another battlefield. Surrounded by students who had parents to fund their tuition, who walked into class wearing brand new clothes and carried the latest laptops, I felt like an intruder. My notebooks were secondhand, my pens borrowed, and my assignments typed on an old computer that froze every other hour. But what I lacked in resources, I made up for determination. While others partied, I studied. While they slept, I worked. Professors began to notice me, not as the invisible child I once was, but as the young woman who never gave up, who turned in essays with passion blazing through every word. Their praise didn't fill the void my parents had left, but it gave me something new: belief in myself. It was during these years that I met the first person who ever truly saw me, Lena, a fellow student who later became my assistant. She noticed me sitting alone in the library one night, surrounded by stacks of books and scribbled notes, my eyes red from exhaustion. She slid into the chair across from me and said, "You look like someone who's building an empire." I laughed then, thinking she was joking, but she wasn't. She saw something in me that even I struggled to see. From that night on, we became inseparable, partners in ambition, sisters in spirit. She was the first to tell me, "You're not useless, Isabella. You're unstoppable." And even though I struggled to believe it, her words planted roots inside me. After graduation, while many of my classmates stepped into comfortable jobs through family connections, I faced rejection after rejection. My resume was thin, my background unimpressive, and no one cared how hard I had worked to get there. Doors slammed in my face. Interviews ended with forced smiles and empty promises, and each no stung like an echo of my parents' voice. But failure didn't scare me anymore. I had grown up in silence, in shadows. I knew how to survive without applause, so I took the risk no one else dared. I started something of my own. It began in a corner of my apartment. Just me, a laptop that barely functioned, and an idea. I worked night and day, building the foundations of what would one day become my company. Lena stood beside me, handling details, encouraging me when the nights grew too long, and reminding me that we were building something bigger than survival. We were building proof. Proof that every dismissal, every insult, every act of neglect had forged a woman who would not be erased. Months turned into years, small projects turned into contracts, and slowly the world began to take notice. Articles were written, investors came calling, and one morning I held in my hand the first official badge of my company, silver and engraved with my name, Isabella Hayes, founder and CEO. For a long time, I just stared at it, my fingers trembling, tears burning my eyes. It wasn't just a badge. It was the evidence that I had transformed their word useless into something powerful. But even in that moment of triumph, a part of me wondered if my parents would care. Would they be proud if they knew? Would they finally say my name with respect? Or would they simply ignore this victory, the same way they ignored every small triumph of my childhood? I told myself it didn't matter, that I had built this for me, not for them. But deep down, the child in me, the one who had sat quietly at forgotten birthdays, still longed to be seen. And then, one morning, as I sorted through the day's mail, I saw it. An envelope with gold lettering, my family's handwriting on the front. Inside was an invitation to the grand family reunion, an event where everyone would gather, cousins, uncles, aunts, distant relatives, and of course, my parents. My first instinct was to tear it apart, to throw it in the trash where their words had always put me. But Lena stopped me. She held the invitation in her hands, her eyes sharp and steady, and said, "You've spent your life waiting for them to see you. Maybe now's the time to show them what they've been blind to all along." In that moment, I felt the spark of my vow ignite again. I had left their silence behind. I had built my own name, But perhaps it was time to return, not as the girl they had ignored, but as the woman they could no longer deny. The envelope sat on my desk for days, heavy as a stone, its gold lettering gleaming like it knew the power it carried over me. I picked it up, set it down, walked away, then returned, as if the paper itself was taunting me. All those years I had fought to leave their silence behind, all the battles I had won to build myself into something they could no longer erase. And yet here I was, paralyzed by a simple invitation. It wasn't just a family gathering. It was the stage where my parents would stand surrounded by relatives, basking in the glow of their carefully crafted image, while I, if I attended, would be forced to decide. Would I play the role of the invisible daughter once again, or would I step into the light I had earned? Lena, ever observant, noticed my hesitation. One evening, as we sat in my apartment with takeout boxes scattered across the table and the city's neon glow bleeding through the blinds, she picked up the envelope and said, "This is not their reunion, it's yours. You've been waiting your whole life for this moment. The question is, do you want to go as their shadow or as the woman they cannot deny?" Her words pierced through me. I realized that what frightened me wasn't the thought of seeing them again, it was the thought of them pretending once more that I didn't exist. That pain, sharper than any insult, had scarred me before. Could I endure it again? The days leading up to the reunion became a storm inside me. I would wake in the night, drenched in sweat, hearing echoes of my father's dismissive sigh, my mother's muttered disapproval, my siblings' laughter as they called me useless. I'd sit at my desk, badge in hand, staring at my own name engraved in silver, repeating to myself that I was no longer that little girl. By day, I hid behind my work, burying myself in meetings and decisions, but every quiet moment dragged me back into memories I thought I had buried. I found myself rehearsing scenarios, imagining walking into the reunion hall and being ignored, picturing their blank faces turning away. Then, sometimes, I'd flip the vision and imagine gasps, whispers, eyes widening when they learned what I had built. Both possibilities terrified me, because in truth, I wasn't seeking their recognition anymore. I was seeking closure. Lena watched me unravel and finally stepped in. One night, she placed a hand on mine and said, "You don't have to say a word, Isabella. That's the beauty of it. For years, they silenced you. They taught you your voice didn't matter. So don't give them your voice. Give them your silence. Let me speak for you. Let me be the voice they cannot dismiss." At first, I resisted. How could I let someone else carry the weight of my story? But as I thought about it, I realized she was right. If I walked in shouting my achievements, my parents would only tighten their masks, pretend harder, dismiss louder. But if I walked in quietly, letting someone else hold the mirror to their cruelty, the truth would hit harder than any speech I could deliver. That night, Lena and I devised a plan. Not a dramatic confrontation, not a public humiliation, but a simple unveiling of truth. The power would be in restraint. I remember the morning of the reunion vividly. The city was quiet, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the sleek black dress I had chosen. It wasn't extravagant, but it carried an air of quiet authority. Around my neck, I wore a small silver pendant, something I had bought with my first paycheck years ago, as a reminder that I could take care of myself when no one else would. My badge sat in my purse, its weight more symbolic than physical, and I touched it once, whispering, "This is proof." As Lena entered the room, dressed with her usual understated elegance, she gave me a smile that steadied my trembling heart. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. I nodded, though inside every bone in my body shook. The drive to the reunion hall felt endless. I watched the city blur past the car window, my mind spinning with flashes of memory, my father pushing my award aside, my mother ignoring my drawing, the empty birthdays, the dinners where my voice was drowned. With every passing mile, I felt the little girl inside me clinging to those wounds. But then I'd glance at Lena beside me, her calm presence anchoring me, and I'd remember, I was no longer that child.
I was Isabella Hayes, founder of my own company, a woman who had clawed her way out of silence. By the time the hall came into view, golden light spilling from its windows, I felt the fear inside me transform, not into confidence, not yet, but into resolute. We arrived early, before the room was filled. I stood at the edge of the entrance, listening to the hum of voices as relatives gathered, laughter echoing down the hallway. My chest tightened, and for a moment I thought of turning back, of running. But then Lena placed her hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Remember, you don't need to fight to be seen tonight. You just need to walk in." Her words became my anchor. I inhaled deeply, straightened my back, and stepped toward the doors. Even before we entered, I could already hear my parents' voices, louder than the rest, commanding attention, basking in the admiration of relatives who had never seen past their polished facade. My stomach twisted. I knew once I walked through those doors, everything would change. Either they would succeed in erasing me once more, or I would finally prove that their silence could no longer contain me. The moment I stepped into the reunion hall, the warmth of golden chandeliers and the swell of laughter wrapped around me like a mocking embrace, as if the room itself wanted to remind me of every time I had been excluded from its joy. Relatives I hadn't seen in years filled the tables, cousins leaning in with animated stories, uncles clinking glasses of wine, aunts draped in silk with smiles that stretched wider than truth. And then at the center of it all stood my parents. My mother, elegant in her carefully chosen gown, her posture rigid as though she carried not only her pearls but the weight of pride that had always left no room for me. My father standing beside her with his commanding presence, the same sharp eyes that once cut me into silence. They looked radiant, admired, untouchable. For a brief moment, I stood frozen at the threshold, the little girl inside me screaming, "Don't do it. They'll pretend you're not here again and it will break you all over." My chest rose and fell in sharp breaths, my grip tightening on my purse where the badge rested. And then Lena stepped slightly ahead, her head held high, her calm radiance grounding me. She whispered, almost inaudibly, "Just walk. Let the silence follow." So I did. I stepped further into the hall, the click of my heels against marble louder in my ears than the chatter surrounding me. At first, no one noticed. I was just another late guest slipping into the sea of conversation. But then a few cousins turned, their laughter faltering for a moment as their eyes widened. I watched the recognition spark in them, some surprised, some uneasy. Whispers started rippling across tables. My parents turned too, and for a fraction of a second, their eyes locked on me. I searched their faces for anything, shock, anger, even surprise. But what I found was worse. Nothing. Their expressions remained perfectly composed, their lips curving into the same polite smiles they wore for every other relative. They didn't scowl, didn't frown, didn't even acknowledge me with a nod. They simply turned away as though I were a stranger, as though I had never existed at all. The familiar stab pierced through my chest, sharp and cold, like all those childhood nights condensed into one moment. I felt my breath catch, my throat tighten, the desperate urge to scream, "I'm here! Can't you see me?" But I didn't. Instead, I stood straighter, swallowing the pain. My silence, once forced, had become my weapon. Lena noticed the shift in me, the way my parents' dismissal had ignited the storm in my eyes. She leaned closer and said, "Remember the plan. You don't have to say anything. Let me." I nodded, though my hands trembled. We made our way further in, and the room began to hush in waves as people noticed the tension. My Aunt Clara approached first, her smile brittle as she wrapped me in a hug that felt more like a performance than affection. Well, look who decided to show up. It's been, years? Her eyes darted toward my parents as if checking for approval before speaking to me. My parents didn't turn, didn't blink. They simply carried on with their conversations as if Clara was greeting an invisible guest. The sting of it pulsed in my chest. But Lena stepped forward, her voice calm yet sharp as glass. She hasn't been here because she's been building something real," she said, her gaze locking on Clara's, firm enough to silence her false smile. Clara faltered, mumbling something before retreating, clearly unsettled. That was the first crack in their perfect facade. We found seats near the back, though I didn't sit, I couldn't. My eyes never left my parents, watching them laugh with relatives, raise their glasses, command the room as if nothing were amiss. And maybe to everyone else, nothing was. But to me, every laugh was a dagger, every dismissive glance a replay of my childhood. I was moments away from breaking, from standing up and shouting the truth of who I was, when Lena placed her hand gently on my arm and said, "Wait." Her calmness steadied me. She knew the exact moment to step in, to hold me back from rushing into an emotional battle I would regret. The silence, she reminded me, was still ours to control. And then the microphone crackled. The reunion's host called for speeches, inviting family members to share stories and toast to the legacy of the Hayes name. My father was first, his voice booming, smooth, polished from years of authority. He spoke of family unity, of pride, of generations carrying forward honor and success. He praised my siblings for their careers, for their accomplishments, for their bright futures. Every word was laced with the message that they were the jewels of his crown. My mother added a few soft words equally glowing, and yet through it all, my name never passed their lips, not once. It was as if I truly wasn't in the room at all. I stood frozen, my nails digging into the leather of my purse, fighting the rising tide of raging grief. But before I could crumble, Lena rose beside me. She didn't ask permission, didn't wait for a cue. She walked to the front, heels clicking sharply against the floor, each step commanding more attention than my parents were her speeches. By the time she reached the microphone, the hall was nearly silent. She cleared her throat, her voice carrying steady, unshaken. "Some of you may not recognize me," she began, her gaze sweeping the room. My parents stiffened but kept their masks on. Lena continued, her tone calm but edged with steel. "For years, she was made to feel invisible in this family. For years, her voice was silenced, her presence ignored, her name dismissed. But the truth cannot be erased forever." Every word landed like a blow, the air thick with tension. Relatives leaned in, whispering, eyes darting between Lena and my parents. And then she reached into her bag, pulling out my silver badge. The light caught it, glinting under the chandeliers as she held it up for everyone to see. "This," she said firmly, "is the name of the woman you all chose to overlook. Isabella Hayes, founder, CEO. The one you called useless? This is what useless looks like when she refuses to disappear." The night air hit me like a release as soon as I stepped out of the reunion hall, cool and sharp against the heat that still clung to my skin from inside. The chatter of relatives muffled behind the heavy doors, replaced by the quiet hum of the city beyond the parking lot, where streetlights painted long shadows across the pavement. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours, my chest loosening, my hands unclenching. Lena walked beside me, her heels clicking steadily, her composure unshaken, but I could feel the current of triumph and tension running just beneath her calm surface. I thought the night was over, that we had said all that needed to be said, but then I heard it, my father's voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "Isabella." Just my name, but heavy, sharp, commanding as it had always been. I froze. He stepped into the pool of light cast by the street lamp, my mother just a few steps behind, her face pale, lips pressed into a thin line that quivered with unspoken words. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Years of silence compressed into a single, breathless standoff. My instinct screamed to leave, to keep walking and never look back. But something in me, maybe the same stubbornness that had kept me alive all these years, rooted me to the spot. My father's stride was slow, deliberate, as if he could still intimidate me with sheer presence. He stopped just a foot away, his shadow falling over me, but I didn't flinch. His eyes, once a weapon I had learned to fear, looked different now. Clouded, desperate, the fury in them undercut by the first hints of defeat. "What was that in there?" he hissed, his voice low, controlled, but shaking at the edges. "Parading your success like a weapon against us? You think humiliating your own parents makes you powerful?" My mother hovered behind him, her fingers clutching her clutch purse like it was the only thing holding her together. She whispered my name softly, almost like a plea, but I didn't answer. Instead, I let the silence stretch, the same silence they had forced on me for decades, turning it now into a mirror for their own discomfort. Lena's presence beside me was a quiet shield. She didn't speak, but her steady gaze burned into them, daring them to continue. My father's voice grew harsher as the silence gnawed at him. "We gave you everything, food, a roof, an education, and this is how you repay us? By turning family against us?" He tried to make it sound like an accusation, but it dripped with insecurity, the tone of a man realizing that his narrative no longer held weight. Something inside me shifted then. For years, I had begged for acknowledgement, had screamed silently into the void of their indifference, but standing there under the cold light, I realized I no longer needed it. Their words couldn't diminish what I had built, and their disapproval no longer defined me. I met his gaze and said nothing, only letting the quiet hang between us until his anger curdled into frustration. My mother finally broke. Stepping forward, her eyes glistening under the lamplight, she asked, her voice trembling, "Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you share your success with us first?" The question cut deeper than any insult. I wanted to laugh, to scream, to tell her that I had tried for years, that I had brought home drawings, certificates, awards, that I had held them out with small, hopeful hands, only to watch them be discarded, ignored, dismissed. Instead, I said nothing, only staring at her with a calmness that was louder than words. Lena finally spoke, her voice soft but razor sharp. "She did. Over and over. You just never listened." The silence that followed was suffocating. My mother's eyes flickered, darting away as if searching for an escape from the truth she had buried so long. My father clenched his jaw, but even his posture sagged slightly, the armor of authority cracking under the weight of reality. For the first time, I saw them not as titans looming over my childhood, but as fragile, flawed humans, desperate to control a story that had already slipped from their grasp. And with that realization came an unexpected calm. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to prove anything. I had already won by standing there unbroken while they stumbled under the collapse of their own lies. My father muttered something about family loyalty and airing dirty laundry, his voice low, almost incoherent now, more to himself than to me. My mother reached out, as if to touch my arm, but I stepped back before her hand could meet me. It wasn't anger that made me retreat, it was clarity. The little girl inside me would have clung to that gesture, desperate for warmth, but the woman I had become knew better. That hand was too late. Lena gently took my arm, her voice steady. "We're done here." I nodded, turning away from them, my heels striking the pavement with each sound, echoing like a final sentence. Behind me, I heard my mother's stifled sob, my father's muttered curse, but I didn't turn back. I couldn't, because if I did, I might see the ghosts of the parents that I had once wished for, and I wasn't willing to resurrect them anymore. The night stretched before me, cool and endless, and for the first time it felt like freedom. As we reached the car, Lena squeezed my hand and whispered, "You've already spoken louder in silence than they ever did in words." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting that sink in, feeling the ache in my chest soften, if only slightly. When I opened them again, I caught one last glimpse of my parents standing under the streetlight, small and fractured, their crowns shattered, their empire of silence crumbling around them. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this was the last time they would ever hold power over me.
The days that followed the reunion felt strange, as if I were living inside a dream where the air was sharper, the colors brighter, and the silence no longer suffocated me, but carried a kind of freedom I had never known. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the family network, traveling faster than I could have ever imagined. My phone buzzed with messages from cousins, aunts, distant relatives, some apologizing, some confessing guilt for believing the lies, some simply stunned by the truth that had unraveled in that glittering hall. At first, I ignored them. I wasn't ready to sift through apologies that came decades too late, or words that tried to rewrite history in the soft light of regret. But as I sat in my apartment, badge resting on the table like a beacon, I realized something. Their opinions, their guilt, their whispers no longer mattered. For the first time in my life, I was free from the weight of needing their approval. The only voice I had to answer to was my own. Still, the echoes of that night clung to me in unexpected ways. I would catch myself replaying the look on my father's face when the relatives turned on him, or the tremor in my mother's hand as she reached toward me, too late, too fragile. Those memories didn't sting the way they once did. They no longer cut me down, but they lingered like scars, reminders of the girl I used to be. Lena stayed close through it all, her presence steady as ever, quietly reminding me of the power I had claimed. One evening, as we sat together in the glow of the city lights spilling through my window, she asked me what came next. At first, I didn't know. For so long, my story had been defined by what I was fighting against. By silence, dismissal, erasure, I had clawed my way through shadows just to stand in the light of being seen. Now that I had it, now that my parents' voices no longer dictated the narrative, what was I supposed to do with the silence that remained? I thought about it long and hard, turning the question over in my mind like a stone smoothed by time. And then, slowly, an answer began to form. My parents had tried to take away not just my presence, but my voice. They had tried to convince the world, and me, that I was invisible. But the truth was, my voice had always been there, waiting, growing stronger in the silence. Maybe it was time to use it not just for me, but for others who had been silenced too. So I began to speak. Not to my parents, not to the relatives whose apologies rang hollow, but to the world that had once seemed too vast, too indifferent to hear me. I told my story. First in small interviews about my company, then in talks about resilience, about silence, about the hidden strength in surviving what others could not see. I watched as audiences leaned in, not out of pity, but out of recognition, because so many carried scars like mine, buried under years of erasure, dismissal, and neglect. Every time I spoke, I felt the little girl inside me standing taller, her voice finally heard. And with each telling, the hold my parents had on me faded further into the background, until they were little more than figures in a story I had already outgrown. The company grew, not just in numbers, but in purpose. I found myself hiring those who had been overlooked, ignored, told they weren't enough. I created a space where voices mattered, where silence was not punishment, but choice, where no one had to beg to be acknowledged. Lena often teased me that I had built not just a business, but a rebellion, a quiet revolution against the very silence that had once tried to destroy me. And maybe she was right, but to me it was simpler than that. I wasn't seeking revenge anymore. I wasn't even seeking justice. I was seeking freedom.
and I had found it in giving others the recognition I once craved.